My wife mocked me for being the dumb one after she got a full scholarship to Harvard Law. On her graduation day, my wife's dad announced she'd inherit everything, including our family's $75 million company, a brand new Tesla, plus the $13 million New York mansion. I sat quietly in the back until a stranger walked in, handed me an envelope, and whispered, "It's time to tell them who you really are. My name is Rowan Blackwell, and if you asked my wife Clara or literally anyone in her family what they thought of me, they'd probably pause for a hot second before delivering the same verdict they'd been passing down like some twisted family heirloom for the past 5 years. I was the dumb one. Not just regular dumb. Mind you, we're talking premium, grade A, certified dumb. The kind of dumb that makes people shake their heads and wonder how I managed to tie my own shoes without written instructions. Clara wore her full-ride Harvard Law scholarship like it was the damn crown jewels. And me? Well, I was her court jester, complete with the bells and the self-deprecating jokes that everyone expected me to crack on cue. It's funny how you can become a professional at your own humiliation when you've had enough practice. And trust me, I'd had plenty. Family dinners at the Blackwell Mansion were basically a weekly roast where I was always the main course. Picture this: a dining room that could double as a small aircraft hangar, with a table so long you'd need a GPS to find the other end. Richard Blackwell, Clara's father and the family patriarch, would lean back in his chair like some medieval king holding court, his chest puffed out with pride as he talked about Clara's brilliant legal mind and her exceptional academic achievements. Then, like clockwork, his gaze would drift over to me, and his expression would shift from beaming pride to something that looked like he'd just stepped in dog crap. "And Rowan," he'd say, drawing out my name like it left a bad taste in his mouth, still bouncing between those. What do you call them? Mediocre jobs? The way he said mediocre made it sound like I was personally responsible for lowering the national IQ average just by existing. Clara would laugh along, of course. Her laugh wasn't the warm, supportive kind you'd hope to get from your spouse. Nah, it was more like the sound a hyena makes when it spots roadkill. "Oh, Daddy," she'd giggle, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin like his wit was just too much to handle. "You know I married down. Way down." The table would erupt in polite chuckles, the kind rich people make when they want to seem like they have a sense of humor but don't want to actually commit to a real laugh. Meanwhile, I'd sit there, fork halfway to my mouth, pretending like their words bounced off me like rubber bullets. Spoiler alert, they didn't. I learned pretty early on that survival in the Blackwell household meant mastering the art of strategic silence. You know that old saying about it being better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt? Yeah, well, in my case, they'd already reached their conclusion about the fool part, so speaking up would have just given them fresh ammunition that my seat at that ridiculously long table was always the farthest from Richard's throne at the head. I'm talking about the Siberia of dinner seating, so far away that I practically needed a megaphone to ask someone to pass the salt. Clara, naturally, sat at her father's right hand like the chosen heir she was always destined to be. She thrived in their spotlight, soaking up every compliment and achievement like some kind of praise-absorbing sponge, while I faded into the wallpaper so completely that sometimes the staff would forget to set my place. Clara's mother, Evelyn, was a whole other level of ice-cold sophistication. Picture a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of marble and dressed by a team of stylists who specialized in making people look intimidatingly perfect. She treated me like I was hired help who'd accidentally wandered into the wrong room. "Rowan, dear," she'd say in that voice that could frost windows, "would you mind fetching me another glass of wine? You know where the kitchen is." Never mind that there were actual staff members literally standing around waiting to do exactly that kind of thing. Then there was Marcus, Clara's younger brother, who was already circling the family business like a shark that had caught the scent of blood in the water. This kid was ambitious with a capital A, the kind of guy who probably practiced his handshake in the mirror and had his 5-year plan laminated and tucked into his wallet. He'd look at me like I was some kind of fascinating specimen in a zoo exhibit labeled "What Not to Become." The only person who ever seemed to see through the whole charade was my old friend Theo. We'd grab beers at this dive bar downtown, the kind of place where nobody cared if you went to Harvard or dropped out of community college, and he'd shake his head while I told him about the latest family dinner disaster. Man, They're using you as their personal punchline, he'd say, peeling the label off his beer bottle with more intensity than the task really required. They'll keep treating you like the joke until you stop being one. I'd laugh it off, tell him it wasn't that bad, that Clara and her family were just particular about success. But deep down, in the part of my brain that I tried to keep locked up tight, I knew he was right. I was their entertainment, their way of feeling better about themselves, their living, breathing example of what happened when you didn't measure up to Blackwell standards. The thing is, I told myself I could endure their games forever. I'd built up this whole mental fortress of acceptance, convincing myself that this was just how things were, how they'd always be. I was the dumb one. Clara was the brilliant one, and that was our dynamic until death do us part. I figured I'd spend the rest of my life playing my assigned role, nodding along when they made their jokes, clapping when they celebrated Clara's achievements, and slowly disappearing into the background until I was basically furniture with a pulse. But here's the thing about forever. It's got a funny way of ending when you least expect it. I didn't know it then, sitting at that endless table, picking at my overpriced dinner while they picked at my self-esteem, but the night of Clara's graduation was going to rewrite everything. Not just the evening, not just our relationship, but the entire story I'd been telling myself about who I was and what I deserved. Looking back now, I can see that all those silent dinners, all those practiced smiles in the face of their casual cruelty, all those moments when I bit my tongue instead of fighting back, they were just the setup for the main event. The universe was apparently just waiting for the perfect moment to drop the biggest plot twist of my life right into my lap, and boy, was it going to be a doozy. Clara's success wasn't just the family's pride and joy. It was their full-time obsession, like a religion where she was both the deity and the high priestess. We're talking about a woman who spent her Harvard summers backpacking through Europe on the family dime, posting Instagram photos that looked like they belonged in a damn travel magazine. Studying constitutional law at the Louvre, she'd caption a selfie where she looked like she'd stepped off a movie set, all windswept hair and designer sunglasses. Meanwhile, I was spending my summers elbow-deep in engine grease at Jimmy's auto shop, trying to figure out why Mrs. Peterson's Honda was making that weird grinding noise. The media ate Clara up like she was prime rib at a starving man's buffet. Local magazines ran features about her genius legal mind and her bright future in corporate law. There was this one article. I still remember it because Clara had it framed and hung in our bedroom like some kind of shrine to herself, where they called her a rising star in the legal firmament. I had to look up what firmament meant, which probably would have given the whole family a good laugh if I'd been dumb enough to ask. And me? Well, while Clara was out there being a rising star in whatever the hell a firmament was, I was washing cars at the local detail shop, fixing fences for neighbors who paid me in cash and complained about how long it was taking, and pulling warehouse shifts that started before the sun came up and ended after it went down. My hands were permanently stained with motor oil, my back ached from lifting boxes that seemed to get heavier every week, and my bank account was about as impressive as a participation trophy. Every single time I managed to scrape together something that resembled an achievement, like when I got promoted to shift supervisor at the warehouse, or when I saved up enough to buy that used pickup truck, Richard would dismiss it faster than you could say Harvard law. Pocket change compared to Clara's future, he'd say, waving his hand like he was swatting away an annoying fly. That girl's going to be making more in a month than you'll see in a year, Rowan. Maybe 2 years. Clara would smirk, that special smirk she reserved for moments when she wanted to remind me exactly where I stood in the grand hierarchy of human worth. Don't feel bad, Rowan, she'd say, patting my arm like I was a dog who'd tried really hard to fetch the stick but brought back a random branch instead. Not everyone can be extraordinary. The world needs ordinary people too. Ordinary. That word hit me like a slap every time she said it, which was pretty much whenever the opportunity presented itself. At parties, she'd introduce me as my husband, Rowan. He's very grounded. The pause before grounded was always long enough for people to fill in their own conclusions about what that really meant. Spoiler alert, it didn't mean spiritually centered or well-adjusted. But here's the thing that none of them bothered to notice while they were busy patting themselves on the back for Clara's achievements. I wasn't actually as stupid as they thought I was. Shocking, I know. All those long hours at mind-numbing jobs, all those early mornings and late nights, All that pocket change Richard was so quick to dismiss. It was adding up. I was building something quietly, like a termite working away inside the walls of a house. Every paycheck, no matter how small, I'd skim a little off the top and tuck it away in a savings account that nobody asked about, because nobody cared enough to ask. $20 here, $50 there, whatever I could manage without Clara noticing that our joint account was running a little leaner than usual. She was too busy basking in the glow of her own brilliance to pay attention to our mundane financial details anyway. I was getting stronger, too, not just financially, but physically. All that manual labor that Richard liked to sneer about was turning me into something that probably would have surprised them if they'd bothered to look. Carrying boxes, fixing engines, hauling fence posts. It was like getting paid to work out, except instead of some fancy gym membership that cost more than I made in a week, I was getting muscles and a paycheck at the same time. My boss at the warehouse, Victor Ramirez, was one of the few people who seemed to see past the dumb one label that had been slapped on my forehead like a permanent name tag. Victor was this stocky guy with calloused hands and sharp eyes who'd worked his way up from nothing and didn't have much patience for people who thought they were better than honest work. "You know what, Rowan?" he said one afternoon while we were taking a break in the shade behind the loading dock, both of us sweating through our shirts in the August heat. "One day you're going to thank me for all this weight you're carrying now. Not just the boxes, but all of it. The whole damn load." At the time, I thought he was just being philosophical in that way that working guys sometimes get when they're trying to make sense of why life kicks the crap out of some people more than others. But Victor had this way of looking at you like he could see something you couldn't see yourself, like he was reading a book that you didn't even know was being written. Even Clara's cousin Janet, who was usually too busy trying to stay on the family's good side to rock the boat, would occasionally whisper things to me at family gatherings that made me wonder if I wasn't completely alone in that house of mirrors. "You deserve better," she'd murmur when Clara was off holding court with some other Harvard grads. Her voice is so low I almost missed it. But when push came to shove, when the jokes started flying and the insults began landing, Janet would just look down at her plate and pretend she hadn't seen anything worth defending. I wasn't stupid, despite what the family consensus seemed to be. I could see exactly what was happening. I was being systematically underestimated, written off, dismissed as irrelevant. And you know what? I was starting to think that might be the best thing that ever happened to me. See, when people think you're not worth paying attention to, they stop watching you. They stop caring about what you're doing, where you're going, what you might be planning. They just assume you're going to keep being exactly what they think you are forever. The dumb one, the disappointment, the guy who married up and should be grateful for the privilege. But that weight Victor was talking about, it was making me stronger in ways they couldn't even imagine. And that savings account nobody knew about, it was growing steadily, like compound interest on their own arrogance. The night Clara's family announced she would inherit everything was when that weight became useful, when all those dismissed achievements and forgotten paychecks started looking like something else entirely, like preparation for a moment I didn't even know was coming. Clara's Harvard Law graduation wasn't just a ceremony. It was a full-blown royal coronation disguised as an academic achievement. I'm talking about the kind of event that makes the Oscars look like a backyard barbecue. The Blackwells had rented out this massive ballroom in Manhattan, the kind of place where every chandelier probably cost more than I'd made in the last 3 years combined. Crystal dripped from the ceiling like frozen tears of joy, and the marble floors were so polished you could have used them as mirrors to check if you had something stuck in your teeth. Valets lined the entrance like soldiers in fancy uniforms, ready to take keys to cars that cost more than most people's houses. A red carpet. An actual honest-to-God red carpet, rolled out from the curb to the front doors, because apparently walking on regular sidewalk wasn't good enough for the guests at Clara's big night. Photographers snapped pictures of everyone who looked remotely important, which meant I got to stand awkwardly to the side, while Clara posed like she was auditioning for the cover of Vanity Fair. The guest list read like a who's who of people I'd only seen on the news or in magazines. Senators who probably had their own Wikipedia pages, bankers whose net worth had more zeros than I could count without taking off my shoes, and CEOs of companies whose logos I recognized, but whose products I couldn't afford. Richard strutted around the place like a peacock who'd just been elected king of all the other peacocks. His chest puffed out so far I was surprised he didn't tip over. I wore the same old suit I'd bought 3 years ago for Clara's law school interviews. Navy blue, off the rack from Men's Warehouse, with a tie that had seen better decades. Clara took one look at me getting dressed and rolled her eyes so hard I was worried she might strain something. "Try not to embarrass me tonight," she whispered as she adjusted her diamond earrings in the mirror, the ones her parents had bought her as a pre-graduation gift that probably cost more than my truck. My role for the evening was crystal clear and brutally simple. Sit in the back, clap politely when everyone else clapped, smile when someone looked my way, and basically disappear into the shadows like a well-trained ghost. I was background noise, human wallpaper, the plus one who existed solely to make Clara look good by comparison. Think of me as the person in the crowd scene of a movie. Technically there, but completely forgettable. Clara floated off to greet her guests the moment we walked through the doors, her law school friends swarming around her like she was some kind of celebrity. And maybe she was, in this weird little bubble where Harvard degrees and family money were the ultimate measures of human worth. I watched her work the room like a professional politician, air-kissing people she probably couldn't stand and laughing at jokes that weren't funny enough to crack a smile from a toddler. Harriet Knox, this sharp-eyed business journalist who looked like she could smell bullshit from 3 states away, was prowling around with a digital recorder and a notepad, probably gathering material for some puff piece about America's rising legal stars, or whatever they were calling overachieving rich kids. These days, she had this way of asking questions that sounded friendly but felt like tiny scalpels poking at people's weak spots. Douglas Vance, one of the board members from Richard's company, spent most of the cocktail hour circling Clara like a shark who'd caught the scent of fresh opportunity. He was this silver-haired guy in a suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, and he kept talking about Clara's natural leadership qualities and her inevitable rise to executive prominence. Translation: he was already kissing ass for whatever favor he'd need from her when she inherited the family kingdom. Then there was Anya, Clara's best friend from law school, who gave me one of those pitying looks that rich people perfect in their spare time. The kind that says, "Bless your heart," without actually having to waste the words. "At least you're supportive," she said, patting my shoulder like I was a particularly loyal golden retriever. "That's so important in a marriage, don't you think?" Supportive. Yeah, that was me. The human equivalent of a cheerleader, except instead of pom-poms, I carried around a collection of swallowed pride and practiced smiles. The ballroom filled up as the evening went on, conversations buzzing with the kind of energy that comes from putting a bunch of powerful people in the same room and watching them network like their lives depended on it. Waiters glided around with champagne that probably cost more per bottle than I spend on groceries in a month, and the hors d'oeuvres looked like tiny works of art that were too fancy to actually eat. I found myself a seat at a table in the back corner, far enough from the main action that I could observe without getting in anyone's way. The table was set for 8, but I was the only one sitting there. Apparently, my assigned table mates were all too important to actually sit down and eat when there was schmoozing to be done. From my vantage point in social Siberia, I watched Richard Gladhand his way through the crowd, telling anyone who would listen about Clara's exceptional academic record and her bright future in corporate law. He had this way of talking about her achievements like he'd personally coached her through every exam and written every paper himself. The stage at the front of the ballroom was set up like something you'd see at a political convention, complete with a podium, professional lighting, and a backdrop that featured the Harvard Law School seal blown up to the size of a small billboard. This wasn't just a graduation party. It was a campaign rally for Clara's inevitable rise to power. I thought I'd experienced every possible variation of humiliation that the Blackwell family could dish out. I'd been through the dismissive comments, the casual insults, the constant reminders that I was punching above my weight class just by being in the same room as them. I figured I'd built up enough emotional calluses to handle whatever fresh hell they were planning to unleash tonight. But as Richard walked up to that podium, tapping the microphone to make sure it was working, his face glowing with the kind of pride that comes from knowing you're about to make a very public announcement that will cement your daughter's position as the family golden child, I realized I had severely underestimated just how much worse things could get. The crowd quieted down as Richard cleared his throat, and I felt this weird knot forming in my stomach, like my body knew something my brain hadn't figured out yet. This wasn't just going to be another round of, let's all worship Clara. This was going to be something bigger, something that would make every previous humiliation look like a gentle warm-up for the main event. Richard's voice didn't just carry across the ballroom. It boomed like he was announcing the second coming of Christ, except instead of salvation, he was delivering the gospel of his daughter's inevitable world domination. Ladies and gentlemen, he bellowed into the microphone, his words echoing off the crystal chandeliers and marble walls. Tonight we honor my brilliant daughter, Clara Blackwell. The applause that erupted was so loud and sustained, you'd have thought the crowd had just witnessed someone cure cancer while simultaneously solving world hunger. Hands clapped with the fervor of people who knew their enthusiasm was being noted and would be remembered come networking time. The sound crashed over me like a tidal wave of coordinated admiration, and I found myself automatically joining in because, well, what else was I supposed to do? Sit there like a statue while everyone else celebrated my wife? But Richard wasn't done. Oh no, he was just getting warmed up for what would go down in Blackwell family history as the most elaborate public ego-stroking session ever performed outside of a political convention. He raised his hands for silence, and the crowd obeyed like trained seals waiting for their next fish. As many of you know, Richard continued, his chest practically bursting with pride, Clara has just completed her Juris Doctor at Harvard Law School, not just with honors, but with the highest distinction possible. More applause, more beaming faces, more proof that rich people could turn literally anything into a reason to pat themselves on the back. Then came the part that made my stomach drop, like I'd just gone over the first hill of a roller coaster designed by someone with serious anger management issues. Richard started rattling off Clara's inheritance like he was reading from some kind of dynastic Christmas list written by someone with unlimited resources and questionable priorities. To mark this momentous achievement and to prepare her for the leadership role she was born to fill, Richard announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority usually reserved for kings crowning their heirs, I am proud to announce that Clara will be inheriting the family company, all $75 million of it. The crowd went absolutely nuts. I'm talking about applause so enthusiastic it probably registered on seismometers in neighboring states. $75 million. I tried to wrap my head around that number, but it was like trying to imagine the distance to the moon, theoretically possible, but practically meaningless to someone who counted his wealth in hundreds rather than millions. But wait, there was more. Of course there was more. Additionally, Richard continued, riding the wave of crowd approval like a surfer who'd caught the perfect wave. Clara will be receiving the keys to her new Tesla Model X, fully loaded, naturally, which is waiting for her in the parking lot as we speak. I glanced around and saw people nodding like this was perfectly reasonable, like giving your daughter a car that cost more than most people's houses was just Tuesday for the Blackwell family. Senator Whitmore, who apparently had nothing better to do than attend law school graduation parties, was clapping like he was at his own campaign rally. And finally, Richard said, building to his grand finale like a conductor preparing for the crescendo of a symphony, Clara will be taking residence in the family's Manhattan penthouse, $13 million of prime real estate overlooking Central Park, which I think she'll find suitable for entertaining clients and colleagues. $13 million. For a place to live. I did the math in my head and realized that the annual property taxes on Clara's new digs were probably more than I'd made in my entire adult life. The applause reached levels that were probably violating several noise ordinances. Clara stood up from her seat at the head table, and the spotlight found her like she was a Broadway star taking her final bow. She looked absolutely radiant, glowing with the kind of satisfaction that comes from having your wildest dreams handed to you on a silver platter in front of an audience of people whose approval actually mattered. Her smile was so bright it could have powered half the city. But then, and this is the part that still makes my jaw clench when I think about it, she caught my eye across that vast ballroom. Even with all the distance between us, even with hundreds of people between her table and my lonely corner, she made sure I could see her lips as she mouthed the words that had become her favorite way of putting me in my place. Dumb one. The people near the stage who caught her little performance started laughing. Not the polite, controlled laughter that rich people usually deploy at social functions, but genuine belly laughs like they'd just heard the funniest joke of their lives. Clara's Aunt Lydia was fanning herself dramatically with her program, giggling like a teenage girl at a boy band concert. "Oh, that Clara," she gasped between laughs. "She's just too much." My hands formed fists under the table, knuckles going white as I gripped the edge of my chair hard enough to leave marks. 5 years of this. 5 years of being the punchline, the comic relief, the living reminder of what happens when someone doesn't measure up to Blackwell standards. 5 years of smiling and nodding while they systematically dismantled whatever shreds of self-respect I'd managed to hold on to, but I stayed silent. I'd gotten so good at swallowing my anger that it was practically a reflex at this point. Smile, nod, clap when appropriate, and whatever you do, don't give them any more ammunition than they already have. That was the survival guide I'd written for myself, and it had kept me alive in their world, even if alive was probably too generous a term for what I'd been doing. The applause continued to thunder through the ballroom as Clara basked in her moment of triumph. Senators, CEOs, lawyers, and social climbers all united in their appreciation for a young woman who'd been handed everything she'd ever wanted and convinced herself she'd earned it all. The American dream in action. If your version of the American dream involved being born into wealth and having your success guaranteed before you took your first breath. Richard finally stepped back from the microphone. His work done, his daughter properly coronated in front of an audience that would remember this night and spread the word about Clara Blackwell's inevitable rise to power. The party would continue for hours, with more speeches, more networking, more chances for everyone to celebrate Clara's bright future, while I sat in my corner, like a piece of furniture that someone had forgotten to move to storage. I thought the humiliation was over. I thought I'd reached the bottom of whatever pit they were planning to throw me into. I figured I'd sit through the rest of the evening, drive Clara home to our modest apartment, and pretend like my heart hadn't been ripped out and stomped on in front of 300 witnesses. But then something happened that would change everything. Something so unexpected that it took me several seconds to process what I was seeing. A man in a dark suit was walking directly toward me. Not toward Clara, not toward Richard, not toward any of the important people who actually mattered. He was walking toward me. The man in the dark suit moved through the crowd like he had GPS coordinates locked onto my exact location. While everyone else was still buzzing about Clara's coronation, still caught up in the afterglow of Richard's grand announcement, this guy was cutting through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns with the kind of purpose that made my skin prickle with something I couldn't quite identify. Anticipation? Fear? Both? He wasn't particularly tall or imposing. Average height, maybe mid-50s, with graying hair and the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. But there was something about the way he carried himself that screamed important business, like he was carrying state secrets or nuclear launch codes instead of whatever was making that slight bulge in his jacket pocket. The weirdest part. Nobody else seemed to notice him. Not Clara, who was still glowing in her spotlight like she'd just been elected queen of the universe. Not Richard, who was working the crowd like a politician who'd just announced his presidential campaign. Not even the business journalist, Harriet Knox, who'd been prowling around all night looking for the next big story. This guy was invisible to everyone except me, and that made absolutely no sense. He reached my table in the back corner of the ballroom, and I half expected him to ask me to move or tell me I was in the wrong seat, or something equally humiliating. Instead, he bent down next to my chair, close enough that I could smell his aftershave. Something expensive and understated that probably cost more per ounce than I spent on lunch. "It's time to tell them who you really are," he whispered, his voice so low I had to strain to hear him over the ongoing celebration. Then he slid a thick, white envelope across the table toward me, the kind of envelope that looked like it contained either very good news or very bad news, with no middle ground in between. Before I could ask him what the hell he was talking about, before I could even process what had just happened, he straightened up and melted back into the crowd like he'd never been there at all. I looked around frantically, trying to spot him among the sea of faces, but it was like he'd been absorbed by the very air in the ballroom. Gone. Vanished. Like some kind of corporate magician who specialized in delivering mysterious envelopes to confused warehouse workers. The envelope sat on the table in front of me like it was radioactive. It was heavy. Not just physically, but in that way that important documents feel heavy, like they're carrying the weight of consequences you can't even imagine yet. My name was written on the front in elegant script, Rowan Blackwell. Not Mr. Blackwell, Not Rowan Blackwell and guest. Just my name in handwriting that looked like it came from someone who'd learned cursive from actual nuns. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. I'm not even sure why. Maybe it was leftover adrenaline from sitting through Clara's public humiliation session. Maybe it was the weirdness of having a stranger single me out in a room full of much more important people. Either way, I had to grip the envelope with both hands to keep from dropping it. Inside were legal documents. Not the kind of legal documents I was familiar with. Parking tickets and lease agreements, and the occasional small claims court notice. These were the heavy-duty kind, with official seals and multiple signatures and enough legal jargon to choke a team of lawyers. The paper felt expensive, like the kind of stock that cost more per sheet than I usually spend on dinner. But as I started reading, really reading, the words began to sink in like ice water through my veins. Company shares. In my name. Rowan Blackwell. The Manhattan Mansion. Not Clara's Manhattan Mansion, but mine. Bank accounts I'd never heard of, trust funds I'd never known existed, investments that had been quietly growing for years while I was washing cars and loading trucks. All of it in my name. All of it signed and sealed and legal. On the last page, in handwriting I recognized but couldn't quite place, was a signature that made my heart stop. Henry Blackwell. Richard's father. Clara's grandfather. The old man who'd built the Blackwell empire from nothing and who'd been quietly watching from the sidelines for the past few years as Richard strutted around like he owned the world. But it was the letter tucked behind the legal documents that really knocked the wind out of me. Written in Henry's careful, old-fashioned script, it explained everything in words that hit me like a series of gentle punches to the gut. Rowan, if you're reading this, then the time has finally come for the truth. I've been watching you for 5 years now, watching how you handle their cruelty, watching how you work without complaint, watching how you treat people who can't do anything for you in return. You know humility. You know people, not just power. That is leadership. I had to read that line 3 times before it sank in. Leadership. He thought I had leadership qualities. Me, the dumb one. The guy who couldn't even get a seat at the good table at family dinners. The letter continued. Richard thinks leadership is about commanding respect through fear and money. Clara thinks it's about being smarter than everyone else in the room. They're both wrong. Real leadership is about understanding that every person matters, that every job has dignity, that success means lifting others up, not standing on their backs to reach higher shelves. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped steel bands around my ribs and was slowly tightening them. For the first time in 5 years, hell, maybe for the first time in my entire adult life, someone had actually seen me. Not the version of me that Clara and her family had created, not the caricature they'd painted for their own amusement, but the real me. The me who remembered the names of every person I'd ever worked with, who asked about their kids and their problems and their dreams. The me who'd never missed a day of work, who'd never complained when the jobs got harder or the hours got longer. The me who'd been quietly saving money and building strength while everyone else was busy writing me off as irrelevant. Claire Monroe, one of the junior associates from Richard's company, was watching me from across the room with a look of suspicion that made me realize I probably wasn't doing a very good job of hiding my shock. My hands were still shaking, and I was pretty sure my face had gone through several different colors in the past few minutes. But for once in my life, I didn't care who was watching or what they might think. My legs felt like they were made of jelly, but my resolve, something I didn't even know I possessed, was solid as concrete. The envelope had changed everything. Not just the money or the property or the legal ownership of assets I'd never dreamed of having. It had changed how I saw myself. I stood up from that table in the back corner, the envelope clutched in my hands like a shield, and started walking toward the stage where Clara was still basking in applause that suddenly seemed a lot less impressive than it had 5 minutes ago. Time to tell them who I really was. The walk from my table to the stage felt like it took about 3 hours and 3 seconds at the same time. Every step across that polished marble floor echoed in my head like gunshots, and I could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes starting to notice that the dumb one was moving around without permission. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they got quieter, the way they do when people sense something interesting is about to happen but aren't sure if they should be worried or entertained. Richard was still basking in the afterglow of his grand announcement, shaking hands and accepting congratulations like he'd just won the Nobel Prize for exceptional fathering. His smile was so wide it looked like it might crack his face in half, and he had that satisfied glow that comes from knowing you've just publicly cemented your legacy in front of everyone who matters. But as I got closer to the stage, climbing those 3 little steps that might as well have been Mount Everest for all the effort they took, his expression started to shift. The smile faltered like a light bulb with loose wiring, and his eyes narrowed with the kind of confusion that comes from seeing your least favorite person doing something unexpected. "Rowan," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying that warning tone that parents use when their kids are about to embarrass them in public, "this isn't your place." The crowd had gone quiet now, that kind of dead silence that happens when everyone realizes they're about to witness either something spectacular or something spectacularly awful. I could feel their collective attention focused on me like a laser beam. And for a second, just 1 second, the old me almost turned around and slunk back to my corner table like a scolded dog. But then I remembered Henry's letter. I remembered that someone had actually seen me, had believed I was worth something more than comic relief and casual cruelty. I reached for the microphone, and Richard's hand shot out to stop me, but I was faster than he expected. Apparently, all that warehouse work had given me better reflexes than anyone had bothered to notice. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying across the ballroom with a steadiness that surprised even me, "this moment belongs to me." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a champagne glass drop in the kitchen. 300 people, all frozen like someone had hit the pause button on the entire evening. Clara's mouth fell open like she was trying to catch flies, and I could see the exact moment when her brain started trying to process what was happening. I held up the envelope, raising it high enough that everyone in the ballroom could see it, like I was holding up some kind of sacred document. Which, in a way, I guess I was. "Henry Blackwell chose me," I announced, my words cutting through the silence like a sword through silk. "Not Clara. Not Richard. Me. The company, the mansion, the accounts. All of it was placed in my name." The gasps that erupted from the crowd sounded like a bunch of people had just been collectively punched in the stomach. I heard someone's champagne glass actually hit the floor and shatter, and Harriet Knox whipped out her digital recorder so fast I thought she might give herself whiplash. Richard lunged for the documents in my hand like a desperate man grabbing for a life preserver, but before he could reach them, there was this sound, tap, 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 that made everyone in the ballroom freeze like they'd heard the voice of God himself, a walking, cane-hitting marble floor. Slow, deliberate, authoritative. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Henry Blackwell made his way toward the stage. He was frail, no point in pretending otherwise, but there was something unbreakable in the way he carried himself, like he was made of steel wrapped in old paper. At 92 years old, he moved with the kind of dignity that comes from knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you're worth. The man was a living legend, the kind of guy who'd built an empire with his bare hands back, when that actually meant something. He'd started with nothing and turned it into $75 million of pure American success story. And now he was walking across his granddaughter's graduation party to back up the dumb one. I knew exactly what I signed, Henry said, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom without any need for a microphone. Years of commanding boardrooms had given him the kind of projection that comes from genuine authority rather than inherited bluster. "Rowan is my heir." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted my announcement. This was the silence of people who suddenly realized they'd been playing a game without knowing all the rules, and the rules had just changed in ways that made their heads spin. For the first time in my entire adult life, people were clapping for me. Not polite, obligatory applause because someone told them to, not the kind of scattered clapping you give to the opening act before the main event. Real applause. Enthusiastic applause. The kind of applause that comes from people who are genuinely impressed and maybe a little bit awed. It started slowly, with just a few people who seemed to understand what had just happened, but it spread through the ballroom like wildfire. Hands coming together in genuine appreciation, faces lighting up with something that looked suspiciously like respect. Even some of the people who'd been laughing at Clara's dumb one comment 20 minutes earlier were clapping like they'd suddenly remembered their manners. Clara looked terrified. Not angry, not confused, but actually terrified, like someone had just told her that everything she'd ever believed about her place in the world was a lie. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were gripping the edge of her table so hard I could see her knuckles turning white from where I stood on the stage. Elias Chun, the head of PR for Richard's company, was furiously scribbling notes while simultaneously texting what I assumed were damage control messages to whoever handles crisis management for wealthy families who suddenly find themselves in the middle of a public relations nightmare. MS. Morton, Clara's mentor from law school, looked like someone had just told her that gravity had stopped working. She kept opening and closing her mouth like a fish trying to breathe air, probably trying to figure out how to spin this development in a way that didn't make her star pupil look like she'd just been knocked off her pedestal by the hired help. But Henry wasn't done. He put his hand on my shoulder, not a patronizing pat, but the kind of firm grip that passes authority from one generation to the next, and looked out at the crowd with the satisfaction of someone who'd just played the perfect chess move. "This family changes tonight," he announced, his words carrying the weight of absolute finality. "The future starts now." And for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't standing in anyone's shadow. The applause kept going like some kind of beautiful, impossible music that I'd never heard before but had been waiting my whole life to experience. It rolled through the ballroom in waves, building momentum as more people joined in, until the sound was so overwhelming it made my chest vibrate. These weren't just polite party claps. This was the kind of sustained, enthusiastic approval that politicians dream about and rock stars take for granted. But not everyone was joining the standing ovation. Clara shot up from her chair like someone had lit it on fire, her face cycling through more emotions than I'd seen from her in our entire marriage. Shock, rage, disbelief, and something that looked suspiciously like panic all fought for control of her features. When she finally found her voice, it came out as a hiss that could have stripped paint. "You're nothing," she snarled, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing toward me like a weapon. "You don't deserve this. You're a nobody, Rowan. A warehouse worker who got lucky. You don't have the education, the connections, the breeding." I cut her off, and for the first time in 5 years, I met her glare head-on instead of looking away. "We're not show dogs, Clara. We're human beings. And maybe your grandfather saw something in this nobody that your family missed while they were too busy patting themselves on the back." Henry squeezed my shoulder, and I could feel decades of wisdom and strength flowing through that grip. "This family changes tonight," he repeated, his voice carrying across the ballroom like a declaration of war against everything the Blackwells had become under Richard's leadership. Clara's mother, Evelyn, looked like she'd just watched someone sacrifice a virgin on the altar of good taste. Her face went through several shades of mortified before settling on the kind of pale that usually requires medical attention. Without a word, she gathered up her purse, probably cost more than my truck, and stalked toward the exit with the rigid posture of someone who'd rather die than be associated with whatever scandal was unfolding. Richard followed right behind her, his face so red I was genuinely worried he might stroke out right there on the marble floor. As he passed my table, my former table in social Siberia, he leaned in close enough that I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the desperation in his sweat. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "You think you can just waltz in here and steal what belongs to my family? I'll tie this up in court for years. I'll make sure you don't see a penny of that money until you're too old to enjoy it." Henry's cane tapped against the floor once, sharp as a gunshot. "Richard," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that makes grown men remember they're still somebody's son, "you're embarrassing yourself. And more importantly, you're embarrassing me." Richard's mouth opened and closed like he was trying to argue with gravity itself, but no words came out. After a few seconds of looking like a fish gasping for air, he turned and followed Evelyn toward the exit, muttering what I assumed were creative threats under his breath, but Clara stayed. Oh, she stayed all right, trembling with the kind of rage that comes from having your entire worldview shattered in front of 300 witnesses. Her hands were shaking so badly, I was surprised she could still hold onto her champagne glass. 5 years, she said, her voice climbing toward hysteria. 5 years I've carried you, supported you, made excuses for your mediocrity. And this is how you repay me? By stealing what's rightfully mine. I didn't steal anything, I replied, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. Your grandfather made a choice. Maybe if you'd spent less time reminding me how dumb I was and more time actually getting to know the man who built this empire, you might understand why he made it. The crowd was eating this up like it was the best reality TV show ever broadcast. I could see people whispering excitedly to each other, phones being discreetly pulled out to record what was probably going to be Manhattan social media gold by morning. Harriet Knox looked like Christmas had come early. This was the kind of story that made careers in business journalism. May Carter, the CFO of the company, and one of the few people in Richard's orbit who'd ever treated me like a human being, was standing near the bar with something that looked suspiciously like approval in her eyes. She caught my gaze and gave me the smallest nod, the kind of professional acknowledgement that said, maybe this is exactly what we needed. Jordan Hale, the head of HR, was nodding along like someone who'd been waiting years for this exact moment. I'd always suspected that Jordan knew exactly what kind of toxic environment Richard had been fostering, but had been powerless to do anything about it without support from the top. Well, now the support from the top had a new name. Mine. Henry stepped closer to Clara, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the grandfather who'd probably taught her to ride a bike and helped her with homework. But his voice, when he spoke, carried disappointment so heavy it made the air thick. Clara, you have been given every advantage, every opportunity, every door opened before you could even reach for the handle. But you never learned the most important lesson of all, which is, she snapped, tears starting to form in her eyes. That power without character is just tyranny with better clothes. The words hit her like a physical blow. She actually took a step backward, her face crumpling like someone had just told her that everything she'd ever believed about herself was a lie. Which, I guess, someone pretty much had, but Clara wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and fixed me with a look that could have melted steel. You may have the papers, Rowan, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than all her shouting had. But you'll never have me. You think you've won something here tonight? You've won nothing. Because at the end of the day, you're still the same pathetic little man who couldn't even command respect from his own wife. The ballroom had gone quiet again, everyone waiting to see how I'd respond to what was clearly intended as the killing blow. 5 years ago, hell, 5 hours ago, those words would have destroyed me. They would have sent me crawling back to my corner, apologizing for daring to think I deserved better, but Henry's letter was still folded in my pocket, and his hand was still on my shoulder, and for the first time in my adult life, I knew exactly who I was and exactly what I was worth that I looked at Clara, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since we'd gotten married, and my answer came out calm and clear and absolutely final. I don't need you to have the future, Clara. I never did. The next morning hit me like a freight train made of possibility and panic. I woke up in my cramped apartment. The same place I'd been living while Clara got to dream about her $13 million Manhattan penthouse. And for about 30 seconds, I wondered if the whole thing had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Maybe I'd finally snapped from years of being treated like furniture with a pulse, and I'd just imagined walking up on that stage and dropping the biggest bombshell in Blackwell family history. But then I saw the envelope on my nightstand, thick and real and absolutely not a figment of my imagination. And reality came crashing back like a cold shower made of pure adrenaline. I was the heir to a $75 million empire. Me, Rowan Blackwell, the dumb one. The guy who'd been washing cars and loading trucks while everyone else was busy being impressed with themselves. The Blackwell Company headquarters looked different when I walked through the front doors that morning. Same marble lobby, same expensive artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses. Same security guards who'd barely acknowledged my existence during the few times Clara had dragged me to company events. But now they were looking at me like they weren't quite sure what to make of the warehouse worker who'd apparently just inherited their paychecks. Mr. Blackwell, said the head of security, a guy named Thompson who'd been with the company since dirt was invented, Ms. Carter is waiting for you in the boardroom. Ms. Carter. May. The CFO who'd always treated me like an actual human being instead of Clara's embarrassing accessory. If there was anyone in this building who might be able to help me figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with a $75 million company, it was her. The boardroom was intimidating as hell. All dark wood and leather chairs that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. May was sitting at the far end of the conference table, a stack of folders in front of her and an expression on her face that I couldn't quite read. professional curiosity mixed with something that might have been hope. "Well," she said as I walked in, "this is certainly an interesting turn of events." I pulled out the envelope and spread Henry's documents across the polished table like I was laying down a royal flush in the world's highest stakes poker game. May put on her reading glasses, the kind that made her look like she could spot financial irregularities from 3 states away, and started going through the paperwork with the methodical precision of someone who'd built a career on making sure every number added up correctly. After about 10 minutes of the kind of silence that makes you question every life choice you've ever made, she looked up at me and nodded. "These documents are absolutely airtight," she said, and I swear I heard a note of satisfaction in her voice. Henry had his lawyers, every I, and cross every T. "You are officially the owner of everything that matters." The weight of that statement settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Everything that matters. The company, the properties, the accounts, the responsibility for hundreds of employees who'd been showing up to work every day while Richard and Clara played their games of intellectual superiority. "May," I said, sitting down across from her because standing felt like too much work all of a sudden, "I need you to tell me the truth about what's been going on here. All of it." She smiled for the first time since I'd walked in, the kind of smile that comes from someone who's been waiting years to have this exact conversation. "How much time do you have?" Turns out, I had all day. May walked me through 5 years' worth of financial records that read like a case study in how to run a company into the ground while making yourself rich in the process. Richard had been treating the business like his personal piggy bank, approving bonuses for himself and his inner circle while cutting benefits for the workers who actually kept the lights on. Vendor contracts that coincidentally went to companies owned by Richard's golf buddies, at prices that would have made a mob accountant blush. But the real kicker was in a folder that May slid across the table with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for revealing the murderer in a detective novel. "This one's going to hurt," she warned. Inside were documents showing that Marcus, Clara's ambitious little brother, had been systematically siphoning money from employee pension funds to finance his own investment schemes. We're talking about retirement money that belonged to people who'd worked their entire lives for the company. Money that was supposed to be there when they needed it most. My hands started shaking as I read through the details. Not from fear or nerves, but from the kind of anger that builds up slow and burns clean. These people, custodians, secretaries, warehouse workers, security guards, had trusted the Blackwell family to take care of them, and Richard and Marcus had been treating their futures like a casino bankroll. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. 3 years, May replied. "I've been documenting everything, waiting for someone with the authority to do something about it. I called for immediate audits of everything. Every bonus, every contract, every expense account that had Richard's fingerprints on it." May's eyes lit up like she'd just been given permission to unwrap the Christmas present she'd been staring at for months. Then I called Jordan from HR and asked her to bring me every complaint that had been filed and ignored, every report that had been buried, every employee who'd been pushed out for asking inconvenient questions. The files she brought could have stocked a small library. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, and hearing someone call me that with actual respect instead of barely concealed mockery was still weird as hell. There are people who've been waiting years for someone to listen to their concerns. I made my first official decision as the new owner. Every employee who'd been wrongfully terminated in the past 5 years would be offered their job back, with back pay and a formal apology. Every vendor contract would be reviewed and renegotiated based on actual market rates instead of how good the vendor was at golf. But I wasn't done. I called Theo, my old friend who'd been warning me for years that I was being used as a punchline, and offered him a job running operations. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Are you serious?" he finally asked. "Dead serious. I need people around me who understand that every job has dignity." Then I called Mr. Lewis, the chauffeur who'd been driving the Blackwell family around for 15 years while Richard treated him like he was invisible and doubled his salary on the spot. By the end of the day, word had spread through the company faster than office gossip about who was sleeping with whom. The dumb one wasn't so dumb after all, and he was just getting started. May handed me one last folder as I was getting ready to leave. "What's this one? Something you're going to want to see," she said with a smile that made me nervous. "It's marked Vendor/Marcus. The betrayal, apparently, ran even deeper than I'd thought. The folder May handed me felt like it was full of dynamite instead of paper. I opened it right there in the boardroom, because waiting until I got home would have driven me absolutely insane, and what I found inside made my blood pressure spike so high I probably could have powered a small city. Marcus hadn't just been skimming money from employee pensions. Oh no, that would have been too simple, too straightforward for someone who'd apparently been taking advanced courses in creative theft. The little bastard had been running an entire shadow operation, setting up fake vendor companies with names that sounded almost legitimate. Blackwell Industry Solutions, Blackwell Procurement Services, Blackwell Administrative Consulting. All of them owned by shell corporations that traced back to accounts in Marcus's name. For 3 years, he'd been billing the company for services that didn't exist, products that were never delivered, consultations that never happened. We're talking about millions of dollars, not pocket change, not rounding errors, but serious money that should have been going toward employee benefits, equipment upgrades, and actual business operations. The genius part, if you could call systematic theft genius, was that he'd kept each individual transaction small enough to fly under the radar. A few thousand here, a few thousand there, spread out over dozens of fake companies so that no single vendor looked suspicious. But when you added it all up, Marcus had been bleeding the company dry while his father praised Clara's brilliance and treated me like I was too stupid to balance a checkbook. May was watching my face as I read through the evidence, and I could see her calculating whether I was going to explode or implode. How did you find all this? I asked. I've been tracking irregular payments for 2 years, she replied. Richard kept telling me to stop asking questions, but I kept copies of everything. Call it professional paranoia. Professional paranoia that was about to save the company from bleeding out completely. I looked at my watch, 6:30 in the evening, which meant Clara and Marcus were probably at the mansion, licking their wounds from last night's public humiliation and plotting whatever counterattack they thought might work. Time for a family meeting. The drive to the Blackwell estate felt different this time. Instead of dreading another evening of casual cruelty and systematic humiliation, I was carrying a folder full of evidence that would blow their perfect little world to smithereens. The security guard at the gate looked surprised to see me, probably figured I'd been permanently banned after last night's scene, but he waved me through after checking some kind of list. I found them in Henry's study, which felt appropriate since that's where the old man had probably made the decision to bypass them all in favor of the dumb one. Clara was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, her perfect composure from last night completely shattered. Marcus was slouched in one of the leather chairs, trying to look casual but failing miserably. The kid's poker face wouldn't have fooled a 5-year-old. Well, Clara said when she saw me walk in, her voice dripping with the kind of venom that could strip paint. Look who decided to show up. Come to gloat, have you? Actually, I said, setting the folder down on Henry's desk with a thud that made both of them jump. I came to give you both a chance to explain this. Clara's smirk faltered when she saw the folder. Marcus went pale so fast I was worried he might pass out right there in his grandfather's chair. The kid tried to play it cool, but his hands were shaking badly enough that I could see it from across the room. I don't know what you think you found, Clara started, but I held up a hand to stop her. 3 years of systematic theft, I said, opening the folder and spreading the evidence across the desk like a dealer laying out cards. Fake companies, fraudulent invoices, pension fund rates. Your baby brother here has been treating the family business like his personal ATM. Marcus broke first, which wasn't surprising since he'd never been as good at hiding his emotions as his sister. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager trying to explain why he'd crashed the family car. I was just borrowing the money. I was going to pay it all back once my investments started paying off. Borrowing. I laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. Marcus, you can't borrow money from people without telling them you're borrowing it. That's called stealing. Clara stepped between us like she was protecting her little brother from the big bad warehouse worker. You don't understand the pressures he was under, she snapped. The expectations, the need to prove himself worthy of the Blackwell name. You couldn't possibly comprehend what it's like to what? I cut her off. To be expected to earn your place instead of having it handed to you? To actually work for a living? Yeah, you're right, Clara. I have no idea what that's like. The sarcasm hit her like a slap. Her face flushed red, and for a second I thought she might actually take a swing at me. Instead, she grabbed the folder and tried to rip it in half, but I was faster. All those years of warehouse work had given me reflexes she hadn't counted on. "You'll ruin us all," she hissed as I pulled the documents out of her reach. "Is that what you want? To destroy everything our family has built just to satisfy your pathetic need for revenge?" "I don't want revenge," I said, and I was surprised to realize I meant it. "I want the truth. I want accountability. I want the people who've been stolen from to get their money back." That's when Henry walked into the study, moving slowly but with purpose. He looked at the three of us, Clara red-faced and furious, Marcus pale and shaking, me standing there with evidence of his grandson's crimes, and shook his head like he'd just witnessed the final collapse of everything he'd tried to build. "The Blackwell name needs saving," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of disappointment, not parading around like it makes us better than everyone else. Clara turned to her grandfather like she was appealing to a higher court. "Grandpa, you can't let him destroy us. He's nobody. He doesn't understand. He understands more than you do." Henry interrupted, his words sharp enough to cut glass. "He understands that respect is earned, not inherited. He understands that leadership means serving others, not serving yourself." That's when Richard burst through the study doors like some kind of avenging angel of wounded privilege. His face was redder than I'd ever seen it, his hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it for hours. "You're destroying this family," he snarled, pointing at me like I was some kind of disease that had infected his perfect world. "Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, and you're tearing it down out of spite." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw exactly what Henry had been trying to save the company from. A man so caught up in his own importance that he couldn't see the rot spreading through everything he touched. "Richard," I said, my voice calm despite the chaos swirling around us. "The rot was already here. I'm just cleaning it up." Clara's eyes were blazing with the kind of fury that comes from watching your entire world crumble in real time. She stepped toward me, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more dangerous than all her shouting. "You may have the papers, Rowan, but you'll never have me. You think you've won something here tonight? You've won nothing." And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I had an answer that came from a place of absolute certainty. "I don't need you to have the future, Clara. I never did." Richard walked out of that study like he was making some kind of grand dramatic exit from a play nobody wanted to see anymore. His footsteps echoed down the marble hallway, each one sounding like a door slamming shut on the old way of doing things. Evelyn followed right behind him, her designer heels clicking out a staccato rhythm of wounded pride and social mortification. They didn't say goodbye, didn't look back, didn't even pretend like they were going to fight for what they thought was theirs. They just left, like the whole empire Henry had built was suddenly beneath their dignity. Marcus, on the other hand, took a different approach entirely. Maybe it was because he was younger, maybe it was because he actually understood the kind of legal trouble he was staring down, or maybe he just didn't have the same delusional sense of entitlement that seemed to run in the rest of the family like a genetic disease. Whatever the reason, when I laid out his options, sign a sworn confession and agree to pay back every stolen penny, or explain his creative accounting methods to a federal judge, he folded faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. "I'll sign whatever you want," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The kid who'd been so cocky and ambitious just a few days ago looked like he'd aged about 10 years in the span of a single conversation. "I'll pay it all back, every cent. Just, please don't let this destroy what's left of the family." It was almost enough to make me feel sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered all those pension fund statements, all those employees who'd been counting on money that Marcus had treated like his personal investment portfolio, and the sympathy dried up pretty quickly. Clara, though? Clara refused everything. Not just the olive branch I was trying to extend, not just the chance to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of her entitled worldview, but the entire reality of what was happening. She stood there in Henry's study, surrounded by the evidence of her family's corruption, and she chose to believe that somehow this was all just a temporary setback that she could overcome through sheer force of will and inherited superiority. "This isn't over," she said, gathering up her purse and her wounded pride with equal care. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what belongs to us? You think having those papers makes you worthy of the Blackwell name? You'll never be anything more than the hired help who got lucky. And with that final shot, she stormed out of the study and out of my life, disappearing into the same shadows she'd spent 5 years forcing me to inhabit. The irony wasn't lost on me. Clara Blackwell, the brilliant Harvard lawyer who'd always been destined for greatness, choosing to vanish rather than face a world where she wasn't automatically the smartest person in the room. But I stayed. Of course I stayed. This was my responsibility now, my chance to prove that Henry's faith in me hadn't been misplaced. The first thing I did was rehire every employee who'd been pushed out during Richard's reign of financial terror. Janet from accounting, who'd been fired for asking too many questions about vendor payments. Bob from maintenance, who'd been let go for budget reasons right after he'd complained about safety violations. Sarah from HR, who'd been shown the door for trying to investigate harassment complaints that implicated Richard's golf buddies one by one. They came back. Some of them were suspicious at first, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate joke or temporary publicity stunt. But when they saw their first paychecks, with back pay included, and when they realized that their new boss actually remembered their names and asked about their families, the skepticism started turning into something that looked suspiciously like hope that we started a dignity fund, because that seemed like the kind of thing Henry would have approved of. Every employee, from the CEO down to the newest janitor, got access to educational grants, emergency assistance, and healthcare benefits that actually covered the things they needed covered. Not because it was good for PR or because it made us look progressive, but because it was the right thing to do. The press coverage was interesting, to say the least. Instead of the usual puff pieces about Clara's academic achievements and bright future, they started printing stories about the quiet choice Henry had made, about the warehouse worker who'd proven that worth isn't measured in degrees or bank account balances. Harriet Knox wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal called The Blackwell Revolution, When Humility Beats Hubris, and suddenly reporters were calling me for interviews about leadership and corporate responsibility. But the moment that really mattered to me happened on a Tuesday afternoon when I drove out to Millie's Diner, the place where I'd washed dishes for 6 months when money was tight and Clara was reminding me daily that I was dragging down the family's social standing. Millie was still there, still serving coffee that could strip paint and pie that could heal emotional wounds, still treating every customer like they mattered regardless of what kind of car they drove or what kind of clothes they wore. "Well, I'll be damned," she said when she saw me walk through the door. "If it isn't Mr. Big Shot himself. You here to buy the place and turn it into some fancy bistro." "Actually," I said, sliding into the same booth where I'd eaten countless meals that cost less than Clara spent on a single cocktail, "I'm here to fund a scholarship program in your name, for kids who need a second chance, who maybe didn't get handed everything on a silver platter." Millie's eyes filled up with tears, and for a minute I was worried I'd overstepped somehow. But then she laughed, that same deep belly laugh that had made even the worst shifts bearable. "You always were too good for those people," she said, refilling my coffee cup like old times. "I just wish it hadn't taken you so long to figure it out." Theo got his office badge on a Thursday, and watching him walk through the Blackwell Industries lobby in his new suit was better than any bonus I could have given myself. Mr. Lewis, the chauffeur who'd spent 15 years being treated like furniture, got an invitation to sit at my table instead of waiting outside, and the look of surprise on his face was worth more than all of Richard's approval would have been that AT night. When the offices were quiet and the cleaning crew was working their magic, Henry and I would sit in his study and talk about the future. Not the future that Richard had planned, where power meant crushing anyone who got in your way, or the future that Clara had envisioned, where intelligence was a weapon to be used against people who hadn't been as fortunate in the genetic lottery. "Do you see it now?" Henry asked me one evening, his voice tired but satisfied. "Do you understand what leadership really means?" "Yes," I said, looking out the window at the city lights that suddenly seemed brighter, more welcoming. The lights look different when they shine on everyone. I recorded my story that night, speaking into my phone like I was leaving a message for every person who'd ever been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough to deserve respect. If you've ever been called less, remember, your worth isn't their vote. When your moment comes, the truth will speak louder than every insult they ever threw at you. The next morning, there was another white envelope on my desk. My hands barely shook as I opened it this time. Inside was Henry's handwriting one final time. Now show them what a Blackwell really is. Game on.